Okay, hello Bio, this is Mr. B, and we are going to continue on with Chapter 17. The title of this section is called Evolution of Multicellular Life, so we're going to actually get to see how our first complex organisms formed, because we've been talking about up to this point what early Earth was like, and the only type of life on early Earth was our single-celled microscopic bacteria-like things, and then our origin of our cells occurred then. So now we're going to take a look at all the different time periods. If you remember when we did that coloring sheet with all the different eras and periods, we're going to take a look at the major events that occurred in each one of those things. So our first major kind of time frame is called Precambrian time, and this is our earliest time period, and few fossils exist from this time because the animals were all soft-bodied. So remember we talked about the formation of a fossil. You guys saw the bones of the fish, that's what became the fossil. So hard body parts were what makes up fossils. So if you're made up of all soft parts like a cartilage and muscles and things like that, then you're not going to be able to form a fossil. And also during this time, life existed only in the sea. So we do not have a lot of fossil record from this time period because all of our multicellular organisms that were alive were very soft-bodied and therefore did not leave any fossils behind. So after Precambrian time, we had what is known as the Paleozoic era, and so we're going to look at some of the characteristic life forms that make up this era. And it says, rich fossil evidence shows that early in the Paleozoic era, there was a diversity of marine life. So looking at our fossils, we can tell that we had a lot of life that was living inside of the oceans during this era. And the Paleozoic era, remember era is our bigger division, is divided into the following periods. So within the Paleozoic, we have what's known as the Cambrian period, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, and the Permian. Now, I would never ask you to rattle all those off in a row. I just want you to know, we're going to do an activity in class to kind of help with this, kind of the major events that occurred within each one of these periods. So with the Ordovician, starting with the Cambrian, because that comes right after Precambrian, so that makes sense. So in this period, the diversification of life occurred, and it is known as the Cambrian explosion. So this is a really important concept that you're going to need to know, is that and during this period, life really took off and started to develop a lot. So Precambrian was all soft-bodied animals, and so now we have the Cambrian explosion, so we have a lot of different type of life now. And the first known representatives of most animal phyla evolved. So we're going to get into maybe in biology too how things are classified. So phyla is just one of the ways that animals are classified. And so all of the origins of most of our current animals today came around during this time. And we have things like invertebrates, brachiopods, and trilobites, and these brachiopods and trilobites are just terms for some of the more popular sea creatures that were alive during this time. So Cambrian explosion is the most important thing to know about the Cambrian period. So now for the Ordovician and Silurian periods, some arthropods became the first land animals. So an arthropod is just an example of our crayfish, our lobster that we have is an arthropod. Things like insects became the first animals to live on land. And then our first vertebrates appeared. So these are animals that have a backbone. They're the first ones to appear, and they came in the Ordovician and Silurian periods. And then also our first land plants evolved from aquatic ancestors. So up to this point, we didn't have any plants living on land until our Ordovician and Silurian periods came along, and these were the major characteristics at this time. So after the Ordovician and Silurian, we had the Devonian, and some plants adapted to drier areas and invaded more habitats. So our first land plants occurred here, and then during the Devonian, they kind of adapted to live in areas where there's less water, so therefore they could colonize more habitats. And then also now insects really appeared, and they started to dominate on land as well. And then the Devonian period is also called the Age of the Fishes. So this is an important thing to know, that the Age of the Fish is known as the Devonian period because many groups of fishes were present in the oceans at this time. And most of these fish had jaws, bony skeletons, and scales. So those were the characteristics of the Devonian period, mainly being we had a ton of fish that were alive during this time. And also, during the Devonian, vertebrates began to invade the land, so we had our first animals kind of with backbones to step out of the water and try to live on land. And some of these early four-legged vertebrates evolved into our first amphibians. And so an amphibian includes, the most famous example would be a frog. It's animals that have to live in the water when they're babies, and then on land as they're adults, but they have to they're pretty much tied to water for most of their life. So this is what appeared during the Devonian. And to wrap up this video today, the Carboniferous and the Permian periods. So reptiles evolved from certain amphibians, so we've had our first snakes and lizards come into the time. And then winged insects evolved into many forms, so insects really took over, and actually during this time there was insects that were dragonflies that would be the size of, they had like a 3-foot wingspan. So insects were actually gigantic during these time periods. And giant ferns and other plants formed vast swampy areas. And then remains of ancient plants formed thick deposits of sediment that changed to coal over millions of years. So this is another really important part. So in the Carboniferous period, there was a lot of carbon, and it was one of our fossil fuels by the coal formed during this time. So the coal we are using today most likely was a remain of ancient plants that lived during this time period. So that's most likely where our coal came from, so we can thank the Carboniferous period for that. However, at the end of the Permian period, there was a mass extinction. So this is an important concept, a mass extinction in which many living things became extinct at the same time. So we know when an animal is extinct, it is no longer alive, and then a mass extinction is when multiple things become extinct at the same time. And so the mass extinction at the end of the Paleozoic affected both plants and animals on land and in the seas, and as much as 95% of the complex life in the oceans disappeared. So there's one major event, or maybe it could have been multiple events that occurred at this time, and it caused 95% of the complex life in the ocean to disappear. So that's it for our first section of section 3. Let me know if you have any questions.